So let's start with a really big question. Why do the world's most educated, policy-aware political elites?
People who are supposed to know what they're doing.
Exactly. Why do they keep making the same catastrophic mistakes?
We're talking about massive foreign policy disasters. Think Vietnam, think Iraq.
Right. Or even domestic blunders, like being completely blindsided by the rise of a populist leader like Donald Trump. How do the people who are supposedly the best informed miss something so huge?
Well, the book we're analyzing today argues the answer isn't a lack of data or a lack of intelligence.
Okay.
It's a fundamental blindness to the single deepest, most underestimated political force there is, the human group instinct.
Group instinct.
When groups feel threatened, identity will override ideology every single time.
And we want you to enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. This is more than just a summary, though we do include that. This feature examines how an author shapes their argument, how they build influence, and how they earn or maybe lose your trust.
It gives you the tools to read with, well, sharper insight.
Should you read this book, this should help. It's also excellent for aspiring writers. And if you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really helps guide our future content.
Today, we are digging into Amy Chua's Political Tribes, Group Instinct and the Fate of Nations. It's a really compelling look at how group instinct, this idea driven by ethnic, sectarian, class, and cultural identities.
It structures everything.
It structures political competition, it fuels deep resentment, and it builds solidarity. All over the globe, and crucially right here at home.
And as we unpack this complex material, just remember, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
So let's set the stage, because the context for this book is everything. It was published in 2018.
Right, into a political pressure cooker.
Absolutely. You've got the fallout from the post-September 11 war still happening. The shockwaves of the 2016 election are still vibrating everywhere. And the debates over identity politics were just reaching a fever pitch.
And Chua basically looked at that moment and saw a crisis of analysis. She felt America was operating under this kind of ideological universalism.
That's a great way to put it. This belief that everyone, everywhere, just wants the same basic things. Free markets, democracy in the Western style, individualism.
And she argues that this way of seeing the world makes us blind to the real power of deep-seated group loyalty.
Precisely. Her primary audience is that educated professional reader. Policymakers, journalists, anyone who's genuinely worried about the polarization and, well, the democratic backsliding they're seeing everywhere.
And to reach them, she uses a really powerful rhetorical device.
The metaphor of tribes.
So why is try so effective as a metaphor?
It's cognitively sticky. I mean, it takes these incredibly complex academic theories. We're talking nationalism, ethno-sectarian conflict, social identity theory, and it boils them all down into one simple, intuitive word.
You hear tribe and you instantly get it.
You do. You get the idea of an exclusive, deeply loyal, competitive group. It translates that academic complexity into something you can talk about.
Which brings us to ethos, how she builds her own credibility. I mean, she's a Yale law professor, so she has the academic authority right there.
She does. But she also leans very heavily on her prior work, especially on market-dominant minorities.
Okay, that's a key concept. We need to define that.
A market-dominant minority is an ethnic subgroup that, for various historical or cultural reasons, ends up controlling a disproportionate share of a nation's wealth.
Like the Chinese in the Philippines, for example.
Or the Igbos in Nigeria, yes.
Right.
Chua's career has been built on studying how these groups become targets of intense resentment from the majority population, who might have political power but not economic power.
So she's got this global expert profile, but she's also the daughter of immigrants.
And that's the other half of her ethos. It allows her to claim a personal insight into that lived experience of group identity, of feeling like an outsider, of vulnerability.
It's a crucial dual identity.
And it leads to her most strategic move, rhetorically speaking. She positions herself outside the fight. She builds this immense moral authority by criticizing identity politics, and aggressively, but she aims her criticism at both the political left and the political right.
Which signals to her target audience, maybe that exhausted centrist reader, that she's not taking sides. She's above the partisan tribalism.
She's the diagnostician, not the ideologue.
Exactly.
And this brings us to the structure of her argument, which is just a masterclass in lowering a reader's defenses. She doesn't start with America.
If she did, it would immediately trigger all those partisan reactions.
Right. Instead, the book begins with a deep dive into foreign policy catastrophes.
The structure is so deliberate. Foreign failures first, and only then does she pivot to the United States.
It's because the U.S. reader can look at American failures overseas much more objectively. You don't feel personally accused.
So let's talk about those object lessons, because they really ground everything she says later about America. In Vietnam, for instance, what did U.S. policymakers get so wrong?
They completely missed the nuance of local identity. Washington saw the whole war as a simple battle between communism and anti-communism, a purely ideological fight.
But Chua argues this universalist view blinded them.
It blinded them to the fact that for the Vietnamese, it was primarily a nationalist war, a war for Vietnamese identity, and one fueled by deep resentment toward the Chinese market-dominant minority that controlled a lot of the South's economy.
So the U.S. aligned with leaders who the majority saw as protecting this wealthy ethnic minority.
A total misreading of the core conflict.
That's a fascinating inversion of the standard story. And the lessons from Iraq are maybe even more painful because they're so much more recent.
Iraq is probably her strongest case.
Yeah.
U.S. planners just ignored the fundamental centuries-old Sunni-Shia cleavages. They went in thinking they could just install a stable, unified democracy.
But the identity fault lines were way more powerful than any Western political model.
And then the policy of de-Baathification. That turned a political mistake into a tribal catastrophe.
Yes, this detail is so critical. We should be very clear about what de-Baathification was.
After the 2003 invasion, the U.S. completely disbanded the Ba'ath Party. This was the ruling structure, and it was dominated by Sunni Arabs. Now, on paper, that might seem rational.
But in reality,
it stripped hundreds of thousands of educated, skilled, militarily experienced Sunni officials of their jobs, their pensions, their entire social standing overnight.
you instantly create a huge, very capable, and deeply resentful tribal group.
And that group, disenfranchised and humiliated, became the core recruiting pool for the Sunni insurgency, and later, for ISIS. The policymakers in Washington missed the tribal existential reality for these men.
So it proves her point. The deepest group instinct, the need for belonging and safety, was violated by a policy that was completely blind to identity.
So the logical appeal of the book rests on that comparison. If we were so tragically blind to group instincts over there.
Then it stands to reason a similar misreading is happening right here in America with our own polarization.
And that's the pivot. Moving from global catastrophe to the American kitchen table. That's what creates the emotional impact.
The pathos.
Yes, the pathos. And the emotional appeals is all about anxiety and this feeling of threatened belonging. But Chua does something clever. She doesn't just focus on one group's resentment.
She says that today, no group in America feels comfortably dominant.
That's the key phrase. She argues that almost every significant group, and not just marginalized minorities, but white working-class groups, cultural elites, everyone feels under attack, threatened, and fundamentally disrespected.
That reframing is really smart. It takes the reader's own specific fears and repackages them as part of a shared national problem.
It's a very unifying kind of anxiety, and it leads the reader to be more open to her proposed solution. The tone shifts here. It becomes this fusion of diagnostic urgency. She's like a Cassandra warning of doom.
But it's also a kind of moderating reassurance, the civic educator who says we can still fix this.
Exactly. Her explicit purpose is to call for a rediscovery of an inclusive national identity.
And that leads to her big counter-concept, the supergroup.
The supergroup ideal is America itself, or what America is supposed to be. A strong national identity that's big enough to let all the subgroup identities, class, culture, religion, flourish without everything turning into a zero-sum fight.
It requires a unifying civic identity that's stronger than the smaller competing tribes.
That's the idea.
But is she just suggesting we go back to some nostalgic 1950s idea of America? Is that even possible?
That's the big challenge, isn't it? And she tries to elevate her argument by using illusion. She very specifically quotes Langston Hughes's poem, "Let America Be America Again."
Which is not a simple patriotic poem.
Not at all. And by using it, she connects her argument to this long tradition of aspirational, inclusive patriotism. She's suggesting America's true essence isn't an exclusionary white supergroup, but a commitment to an ideal of inclusion that we haven't even achieved yet.
That's a very powerful move to defend her position against the charge that she's just calling for a return to the old status quo.
It is. She's trying to leverage the history of American idealism against the current reality of American tribalism.
And this discussion is meant to inspire reflection and rational thought. For more structured book analyses, summaries, and critiques, you can visit Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel, offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques.
So let's turn to the critical analysis now. This is the intellectually demanding part where we really have to question the framework itself, because the book is brilliant at connecting dots, but the critiques of its core idea are also really powerful.
Well, a lot of reviewers praised its clarity, its ability to provide this single unifying explanation for so many chaotic events is really appealing.
Of course, it connects the failure to stop ISIS recruitment with the sudden rise of Trump and with the intensity of campus culture wars. It rolls it all into one theory. And that kind of coherence is deeply satisfying when the world feels confusing.
But the critical debate really starts with that central metaphor, the tribe.
Yes. Critics argue that the metaphor, as sticky as it is, risks flattening really important distinctions. I mean, if you reduce the complex dynamics of class struggle, of race, of religion, of ideology, if you put them all in the single bucket of instinctual group loyalty, are you obscuring more than you're revealing?
Right. Is the conflict over economic inequality in, say, Appalachia really a tribe, in the same way the Sunni-Shia conflict in Iraq is a tribe? Are we saying they're functionally the same thing, just driven by raw instinct?
That is the analytical risk.
Yeah.
And by focusing so much on group instinct, the framework also risks, well, naturalizing conflict.
Making it seem inevitable.
Exactly. It suggests these clashes are just hardwired human behavior, rather than focusing on the specific, historically contingent things like economic policies or political decisions or institutional racism that actually created the resentment in the first place.
That kind of shifts the blame, doesn't it? If it's all just instinct, then it's not really anyone's fault. It's just how people are.
That is the contention. And this leads to the sharpest critique, which is all about power. Chua argues that both the left and the right engage in equally problematic identity politics.
But critics would immediately ask, is the power dynamic really symmetrical?
That's the question. When a historically marginalized group is fighting for basic recognition or for historical justice, is that really the same thing as a dominant group fighting to maintain its status?
It seems like a crucial distinction.
Critics argue that by framing these as symmetrical tribal clashes, a left tribe versus a right tribe Chua underplays these massive power asymmetries. A fight over voting rights, for example, isn't just tribal politics. It's a necessary fight over structural power, no matter which group is involved.
So in that view, the book risks equating the struggle against dominance with the struggle to maintain it.
And this complexity is key to seeing the political implications. She's walking a very fine, provocative line here.
Between diagnosis and prescription.
On one hand, she's making this urgent call for a return to civic nationalism. But on the other hand, critics point out that her call for minorities to re-embrace the supergroup could be seen as asking them to ignore the fact that the nation-state has historically failed or excluded them.
And that their current tribalism is just a form of self-defense.
Exactly. And finally, by focusing so intensely on the nation-state as the ideal supergroup, her analysis doesn't leave much room for other kinds of solidarity. Transnational movements or deeper critiques of empire that shape identity far beyond one country's borders. The lens is very much focused on the national outcome.
So what's the big takeaway for you, the listener?
I think understanding Chua's rhetorical strategy, specifically how she uses the objective, nonpartisan lens of foreign policy, failure to diagnose these really difficult domestic divisions, that gives you a powerful tool.
It's a tool for analyzing any complex political argument.
Right. It teaches you to look at the structure of persuasion itself, whether or not you end up agreeing with her conclusions about group instinct.
It's about seeing the scaffolding of the argument, not just the finished ideological wall.
And that leads to a final thought. If the greatest danger is this ideological blindness to the power of group identity, we have to ask, what American tribe, or maybe which group's specific resentment, remains the most consistently underestimated or misunderstood by both political poles today?
That's the next layer of analysis for you to engage with. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally. See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.